Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Program Manager for Transportation Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. I want to welcome you to the latest in our CSG Academy webinar series. Today we're focusing on the status of Real ID, which is a coordinated effort by the states and the federal government to improve the reliability and accuracy of state-issued identification documents. The Real ID Act of 2005 was enacted by Congress to implement a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission to set standards for the issuance of sources of identification such as driver's licenses. States and other jurisdictions have made significant progress in enhancing the security of their licenses and procedures in recent years, but hurdles and holdouts remain and key deadlines loom in 2015 and 2016. We're fortunate to be joined today by a couple of folks in Washington who know this issue very well. Brian Zimmer is the president of Keeping Identity Safe, the Coalition for a Secure Driver's License, an organization that promotes and supports Real ID. Mr. Zimmer previously served as senior policy advisor and investigator for the House Judiciary Committee and helped draft the Real ID Act of 2005. And Ted Sobel is the director of the Office of State-Issued Identification Support at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and is a policy and operations specialist for Homeland Security screening and credentialing programs. He also previously managed credentialing programs at the Transportation Security Administration. Mr. Zimmer is going to have some opening comments here at the top before turning things over to Mr. Sobel for his presentation. It should be noted here that when Mr. Zimmer speaks and expresses an opinion about a particular state, he does not speak for the Department of Homeland Security, only Mr. Sobel does. Following Mr. Sobel's presentation, he will respond to questions put to him by Mr. Zimmer, and then we will open up to questions from those of you watching our webinar today. If you have a question or a comment for one of our guests, you may type it into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer at any time. We will collate those here in Lexington, and I'll ask as many as time allows. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Brian Zimmer.
Hello, whoever's out there attending our webinar, thank you for taking the time to participate. My comments prior to DHS's presentation are limited to a fast run-up from our point of view from the issuance of the Real ID regulations in January 2008. That is that there was a core of states, about a dozen, who immediately embraced Real ID, both for its national security / homeland security aspects, but also because they saw it as being helpful in correcting and assisting with law enforcement and improving the quality of their state registration or driver's license user and holders record systems. There was another group that almost immediately said, well, they weren't really opposed to Real ID, but they weren't in a hurry to get to the costs and complexities of getting there. And there were finally then a third group that, for mostly philosophical reasons, opposed the role of the federal government with setting standards for driver's licenses. My organization has been around since 2001 and relished the idea of a national standard for driver's licenses, particularly pertaining to the issuance process, that is the determination of whether a person standing at the counter was exactly whom she or he claimed to be, what is termed generically claims of identity. And we are strong advocates for authenticating people's identities when they apply for driver's licenses, both to prevent foreign terrorists and domestic terrorists from taking advantage of the system, since driver's licenses provide access to explosives as well as guns under our regulatory apparatus. If anyone has a question, individual questions about state circumstances, please direct them to me after Mr. Sobel's presentation, and I will do my best, since we maintain a rather large compendium of information about the states with regard to not only Real ID compliance, but some other related security matters. So that pretty much wraps up my preparatory comments.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you, Sean, for this opportunity to address the guests and members of the Council of State Governments. If you go on to the next slide, please. I'm going to really just break up my presentation into 3 broad areas. There's about 7 or 8 slides to go through, so I'm expecting about 15 minutes or so for the presentation, so you guys can set off your alarms accordingly, and then turn it over for questions. If you go on to the next slide, please. So I'd like to start at this point. It's the 9/11 Commission report, because that's really what Real ID has its roots in. Following 9/11, commission of very highly respected experts and policymakers got together and really looked through what went wrong and what lessons learned and what we can do to prevent 9/11 from happening again. And one of the recommendations to come out of it was that the federal government should set standards for the issuance of birth certificates and sources of identification, in particular driver's licenses. Specifically, they were saying the reason why they wanted that is sources of identifications are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are and to check whether they are terrorists. So we make a lot of law enforcement, intelligence, national security decisions based on the identification of individuals. And so the overall goal with the Real ID Act is to ensure that driver's licenses, which are the primary form of identification in the U.S., meet a common minimum security standard for both the issuance and production. If you go on to the next slide, please. So from that starting point, Congress passed the Real ID Act in 2005. And then really to put the details onto that overall principle that the 9/11 Commission report set out. What the Real ID Act does is it, first off, it covers 56 jurisdictions. I tend to use the term states, but technically it's jurisdictions because it's 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. And it says for these 56 jurisdictions, 3 things we're looking to happen. First, DHS, you are responsible for establishing the minimum requirements for the issuance and production of these cards. We did that in 2008. We issued a regulation that really takes this legislation and implements it and gives the details, puts the meat on the skeleton. Second, it authorizes DHS to provide grants to states to help them meet these requirements. Between fiscal year 2008, fiscal year 2011, we provided over $200 million in direct grants to states for strengthening the security of their driver's licenses, plus another $63 million to a consortium of states that were really developing the shared infrastructure for cross-state verification. Then the third part is it prohibits all federal agencies, and this isn't just DHS, but all federal agencies from accepting for official purposes driver's licenses or ID cards from a non-compliant state. The legislation defines the official purposes as accessing federal facilities, boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft, and entering nuclear power plants. It also created a 4th category that authorized the Secretary to add other official purposes. But when we did the regulation, we kept to the statutory language, and so it's really just those first 3, the facilities, aircraft, and nuclear power plants that are covered by Real ID enforcement. So this is important to recognize that Real ID is in no way a mandate on the states. So the federal government does not assume the authority to tell the states how to issue driver's licenses. But what it does say is for us to be able to accept a driver's license from the state, it needs to meet these security standards. And that's an important distinction. Go on to the next slide, please. So before I get into too much with the, actually, if you go back to the slide, I want to make one more point, maybe giving you some information on exactly what those standards look like, what Real ID does, and what it does not do. So what it does is it requires proof of identity and lawful status through the presentation and verification of documents. In particular, it's looking at full legal name, date of birth, social security number, address of principal residence, and whether they meet category of U.S. citizenship or lawful status. Lawful status deals with a person being in the United States who's not a citizen. Then it goes on to require some actual sort of hardware built into the security features built into the card itself. So if the first one is about the information that's presented, that's being represented by the card, the second one is requiring the card design to have security built into it to prevent it from being counterfeited or tampered with, such as having common machine-readable technology and having different levels of anti-counterfeit security features. Then sort of the third and final broad category is it creates some standards around the overall process. So in other words, we're asking states to copy and retain source documents used in verifying the identity and lawful status. It's making sure that employees working on the issuing of driver's licenses have undergone background checks and have been trained to be able to identify fraudulent documents. Have a operations plan that includes making sure that the materials used to produce the driver's licenses are secured from theft. A lot of things, and what you'll find is a lot of this is what states were looking to do in the first place, and that's not a coincidence. In developing the Real ID regulation, we consulted quite extensively with the states to find out what they had identified as best practices, and that along with specific requirements from the law is what we used to build the regulation. What Real ID does not do is it doesn't authorize DHS to regulate the issuance of driver's licenses. Again, state participation is voluntary, but it does set up consequences if a state chooses not to meet the requirements, and those are the enforcement measures that I mentioned mentioned earlier, and we'll get into in a little more detail at the end of the presentation. It also does not regulate what a federal agency may accept for identification purposes other than a driver's license. So it doesn't say that a federal agency must require a ID for accessing their facility. It says if a agency chooses to require an ID, and one of those IDs it requires or it allows is a driver's license, that's when Real ID comes into effect. But it doesn't say suddenly you need a driver's license to walk through the front door of the Smithsonian where you've never needed that before. So it doesn't create a new requirement for identity check, but it does put certain limitations on the use of driver's licenses on existing requirements. Finally, it does not prevent the state from issuing a non-compliant license. So Real ID, both in the law and the regulation, says if a state is issuing compliant licenses that meet these requirements in terms of the proof of identity and lawful status, for people who can't meet those requirements, the state can choose to, if it wishes, can choose to issue a non-compliant card. We don't regulate anything about that non-compliant card except for the fact that we need to be able to tell the difference between a compliant card and a non-compliant card. So a single state can issue both a compliant card, something that meets all the standards, and a non-compliant card, something that does not meet the standards. And we're really just, as long as we can tell the difference between the two, Real ID supports that. Okay, move on to the next slide. To give an idea of the status of jurisdictions, I'd like to show the progress we've made in the aggregate. So there's 56 jurisdictions that I've already discussed, and there's 43 requirements per jurisdiction. That gives us a universe of about 2,400, it's actually 2,408 standards. So here in our office, when we're working with states, we're looking at a total of 2,400 boxes that we're looking to get checked. Based on the information provided from the states, they already meet today 78% of those standards. So it's over 1,800, close to 1,900 standards are being met today. And another over 200 are being planned to meet, so that's about 9%. So all in all today, we either have, states have implemented or on a path to implementing 87% of the requirements of Real ID. Of the remaining 13%, about half are things that certain states say that they might have laws or policies preventing, and about half are we really haven't received sufficient information from particular states on whether they're meeting a particular provision or not. So overall, we have made a tremendous amount of progress, or really the states have made a tremendous amount of progress in making driver's licenses more secure. And we could say without hesitation or qualification that driver's licenses are much more secure today than they were at 9/11. So I'd like to first start off that big picture. I've gone to the next slide. Now the next slide shows how that big picture translates into individual states. What you have here is 3 categories of states. You have states that are fully compliant. That is, there's 23 states that do that. That being fully compliant means they meet all 43 of the requirements per state. So they're 43 for 43. There are currently a total of 23 states that meet that are compliant. That includes Nevada and Delaware, which just became compliant in November. So we continue to add to that list. The second category are what I'll refer to as an extension state. These are states that have not met all 43 requirements, that they've met somewhere less. However, they either have a plan or they are capable of making progress to meet all 43. And under the Real ID Act, in those circumstances, we can provide a state with additional time to come into compliance before they're being subject to enforcement. We give a state that meets the criteria for extensions. An extension lasts for a year. All extensions expire for all states at the same time, which is in October of each year. At that time, we take a look, and states that continue to make progress, in other words, they're not just staying still, but they can show that they've done things and made use of this extra time that they've been given, then they could get that extension renewed. And we're in the final stages of finishing up the renewal process for this year. So right now we have 24 states that have extensions. The final category is in yellow of the slides, and these are states that are subject to enforcement. That means they have not provided information, sufficient information to get a determination that they're compliant, and have not provided a sufficient information or have some sort of structural barrier preventing them from qualifying for an extension. So again, the purpose of an extension is to provide more time to get from here to there, but if a state says that they're unable or unwilling to fulfill requirements, then they could, that would be a reason that they would not get an extension. So we're currently at 9 states. So when we talk about enforcement, we're really talking about currently those 9 states: Maine, New Hampshire, New York, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Arizona, Washington State, and American Samoa. That being said, it's not a static list. If I'd given this presentation about 6 weeks ago, I would have had to add Massachusetts and Alaska to that, but they have subsequently, they had provided us with information that allowed us to grant them an extension. So they moved from being an enforcement state to an extension state in the last 2 months. Okay, the next slide, please. Now into the final third of my presentation, talking about enforcement. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, federal agencies are prohibited from accepting licenses from non-compliant states, including states without an extension, excuse me. However, there was a decision made, a strategic decision made, in order to treat states fairly, to provide states time to transition to Real ID compliance, that instead of just dropping it all enforcement at once, we're phasing it in incrementally. The schedule for that enforcement was released in December of 2013. It's summarized here, that we have the first phase was done in January of this year, of 2014. It was really a pilot that was done here at Homeland Security headquarters. Then the second phase expanded it to federal facilities and nuclear power plants, those areas where access is limited to federal employees, contractors, and their guests. In other words, there's not a general expectation of access, but you either work there or you've been invited to enter the facility by someone who works there. The next category, which is next phase, phase 3, which is coming up in January, is semi-restricted areas for federal facilities. And these are areas where you don't need an invitation to come, but you still need to show an ID. So there is a reasonable expectation of the public that they can access it, but they must present an ID. So you have things like military bases, the National Archives are example of this. I will say we have been requested by the General Service Administration to give them a little more time to do enforcement, to introduce enforcement at some of the larger or more complicated federal facilities. So you may see a announcement in the near future where we might move some of those, again, the larger, more complicated, complex facilities to a later date, but still within 2015. So at that point, that's covering really bringing us into near full enforcement for nuclear power plants and federal facilities. There was, as part of the plan in 2015, we take a step back, we take a deep breath, we do a review and evaluation, we do a study that really looks at how states have progressed in coming into compliance, and what has been the impact of the enforcement phases to date, what are the lessons learned, and use all that information to craft the remaining enforcement dates to get us to full enforcement. So we have identified that enforcement at airports would start no sooner than 2016, but we haven't set a date for it. That will come out of this 2015 study. So the study will help set up a date for when enforcement at aircrafts happens, and also really the nature of how many phases it will take to get to full enforcement for the purpose of boarding aircraft. Some of the things that are overall exempted from enforcement is if you need to access a facility for health, safety, life-preserving services, law enforcement and judicial activities, so FBI investigations, courthouses, those are generally given an exemption from enforcement. And then by nature of what Real ID says, what the Act says, and what the regulation says, it's really limited to access to the federal facility. Once you're in the federal facility, if a agency requires an ID for some other purpose, such as the application for receipt of federal benefits, then their own rules govern, and it's not governed by Real ID. I believe there's one more slide. Is that the last slide? Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. So this combines the previous two slides. It is an enforcement view of the state progress, and what you'll see, the main difference is that agencies treat states that are compliant and states that have extension the same way, which means that they can accept the driver's licenses from those states. For those states in blue, in the darker blue, those are the 9 enforcement states. You cannot accept the driver's license in accordance to those phases of enforcement that I just described. And but it doesn't mean you're denied access to a federal facility. It just means you can't use your driver's license for access to the federal facility. Instead, a federal agency can set up any other procedures that they want, any other types of identity documents that they would accept in lieu of a driver's license. That's totally at the discretion of the state, of the federal agencies. We are working with an interagency group to provide some guidance on to have sort of general best practices to promote some consistency across agencies, such as things like passports, passport cards, trusted traveler cards, things like that, so that we are going to provide agencies with lists of alternative types of documents that they might want to consider accepting, but ultimately that decision is made for the most part at the facility level by something called the Facility Security Committee. The other thing is an agency or facility can have an access procedure that does not rely on a driver's license. So it could be something in terms of escorted access. That again is at the discretion of the agency. However, it really needs to be built around the risk profile of the agency. What are the risks that they're worried about? What are their vulnerabilities? And it should be consistent with the security needs of the facility. So that's my overall presentation. Again, the big points are our purpose here is to promote a common standard for higher security in the production and issuance of driver's licenses. We have seen tremendous progress among states so that collectively, we are in the 85% range of getting full compliance nationwide. On an individual state level, most states are either able to come into compliance or have a pathway and qualify for an extension. And we continue to work with both the states that have extensions and those states that are subject to enforcement to work together to make sure that they have their information that they need to make decisions, that we have the information from the states to be able to determine if they come into compliance or not, or if they made enough progress to qualify for an extension. So it is a close collaborative relationship, one that is very respectful for the sovereignty and the interests of the states. We have not created any new rights of access for the federal government in accessing state information. We have not created a national ID card or a national database. The states continue to control both their databases and continue to control the issuance process. So we believe we have a system here that really helps create this common baseline across the states without interfering with the sovereignty and the decision-making of the states themselves. So happy to turn that over for any questions.
Hello.
Hey, we can hear you now, Brian.
Okay. I want to reiterate the comments that Sean made at the beginning, when introducing us, that we wanted to get some questions from the audience. You can type those questions in, or you can break your silence to ask questions. I sort of thought we might get some questions immediately after you concluded your remarks, Ted, but apparently none. Sean, are we picking up any questions? Sean?
No, not yet.
Okay. Well, the first question I want to address is an old one, and this question is both a central issue for Real ID, and also DHS has made some efforts to ameliorate this problem. I want to give them the opportunity to talk about some of the things that they have done. Real ID was part of there were three provisions in the original House Intelligence Act that addressed 9/11 Commission responses regarding cards. This one was driver's licenses. There were two others that were packaged with it originally and were, in fact, enacted by the Intel Reform Act. One of them was a requirement that the Department of Homeland Security issue regulations addressing birth certificates issuance by the states to promote a higher level of security and better record keeping. The other was to harden the Social Security card so that it would be, one, there would be greater effort by the Social Security Administration to verify the true identity of people when they were issued Social Security cards, and that subsequent reissues would carefully verify employments, and the card itself would move from being a paper document, 1930s circa security paper, into a modern media, presumably a hard card that would be very hard to counterfeit. Neither of those other two actions have really taken place, although the Social Security Administration has not issued new regulations, and the Department of Homeland Security, although regulations were prepared, never actually finally issued them.
Sorry,
so
Brian?
That leads us to the three questions.
Just
Ted,
one point of clarification.
Yeah.
Birth certificates was Health and Human Services.
I did say Health and Human Services.
Okay.
No, it was not the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security,
yeah.
But the Department of Homeland Security, aware that Health and Human Services did not issue them, took steps to work directly with states and with AMVA, American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, to try to fill some gaps that they thought they could fill through grants. And I wanted to make sure that I gave DHS its due. And the first question I have is, the rules set the standards for driver's licensing, accomplishing half the 9/11 Commission recommendations, but no regulations have been issued for birth certificates. In lieu of federal regulations, what has DHS undertaken to shore up the nation's birth certificate records, and what kind of results have occurred in the states? So I know that you're prepared to address that question, Ted.
Yeah, and just to make, so as Brian said, we don't have the authority to put forth standards for birth certificates. That is something that's in the works over at Health and Human Services. So I would defer to my colleagues over there about standards issue. What we have done is we've done I mentioned before that we had a $63 million that we gave the consortium of states. Part of what that money has been used for is some pilots with NAPCIS, which is really the Association for Vital Records Offices. And some of the pilot money has been used to help build the verification systems, and help build and strengthen and improve the verification system so that state DMVs can ping against records to help validate birth certificates or birth certificate information that they've been presented with. This gets into not just the IT systems, but also the underlying data at the Vital Records Office. So we've done a pilot where some participating Vital Records offices scrubbed their information and updated it and fixed it and really and made sure that it was electronically accessible. And the idea was that the higher the quality of the information in the underlying systems, the more use it's going to be for the DMVs to hit against. So you're going to have less errors based on some sort of misinformation or something that had been mistyped on the record side, and more when you have something coming up, it's a true anomaly that needs to be looked into. That's really our goal there. So that's our primary work has been with that, is to help build up the capacity of state DMVs to be able to hit against Vital Records records and be able to use that information in their issuance process.
This is Brian Zimmer again, following up with that question, which is to provide a little bit more information. Department of Homeland Security's grants also facilitated this scrubbing activity, and it actually took place in over 30 states. Do you have an actual count, Ted, in how many states took advantage of the grants?
No, I don't.
Scrub it up. Okay. Well, our information is about 33 states used DHS grant monies to do two things. One, standardize their birth certificate records so that the there was some sort of a central record system within the state where the record information, the biographic information, was made consistent. The last state to do so was Hawaii. Some listening in may gather why that took place, but the point is, at the end of the day, consistent records of people born in those states for the last, ranging from state to state, between 30 and 70 years, was made consistent. Why is that important? Because it's a central proof of birth for citizens who are not naturalized citizens is only available as a birth certificate, and so that's your proof of citizenship. Secondly, it's important because Real ID requires proof of lawful presence, and that would mean for citizens their birth certificate. And finally,
well, and the identification and full name is
correct. The full biographic name,
yeah,
birth name. Finally, the issue that what used to be a profound problem for many, perhaps most DMVs, was the most common type of imposter fraud involved bringing in facsimiles, photocopies, altered documents with false names on birth certificates, and the states had no means to verify whether they were authentic birth certificates or not. So this process of cleaning up and establishing central registry for birth certificates has reduced the level of potential imposter fraud. And I was recently at a DMV in the mid-Atlantic states and asked them if birth certificates were still their primary source of imposter fraud. They said no. That, thank God, is over because we centralized our records, and now it's divorce decrees and adoption records, being fraudulent documents that they most often see being presented as a basis of proof of identity. So I guess, Ted, to give the devil, DHS, its due, that your agency's efforts have reduced the complexity of that problem and made it easier to verify original identity.
And one of the other types of vital records that have been part of this project are also death records.
Right.
Which is a very useful tool to be able to identify cases of fraud.
Right. By cleaning up the death records, people couldn't use birth certificates that they borrowed from people who have died. Question 2, the 9/11 Commission talks about vulnerable facilities. Ted did address this a bit. So I'm asking a question that comes to my attention fairly often, mostly from the press. Are seaports and airport staging areas going to be included in future enforcement requiring secure identification, including Real ID compliant driver's licenses? For the benefit of whoever's listening, most of those are under the control of state governments and or of local municipalities, special commissions. They are not federal facilities.
Yes, so that would be, as you pointed out, they're not federal. Those areas of the buildings are not federal facilities, so we don't have the authority to make that requirement. But it's the information and examples are out there for states to consider. And just like I said in another context, really should be driven by the security requirements and the security profile of a facility or particular areas of the facilities. But again, you would need to, at what point do you are able to do access control? So I think in a lot of cases, airports, that would be very difficult to do before you get to the TSA checkpoint. Whereas seaports, you might have the access control farther out.
Well, from personal experience, I'm aware that Florida, I think unique among the states, has put in very clear access controls to their seaports, cruise ports. I haven't seen the same level of control at the airports, but they definitely have put in a few years ago much tighter access to their seaport facilities. And Ted, I think in the prior life you worked with Florida on the TWIC cards, did you not?
Yep.
So
yes.
Do you have anything to add to my comment?
No, I think just in general, I was going to point out that you do have TWIC for which is a transportation worker identity credential, which is sort of a common security badge for people that have access to secure areas of ports.
Okay, on a similar line, question 3. The Real ID rule appears to include commercial driver's licenses. It is our presumption in my organization that it does. Is it also correct, Ted, that it does include commercial driver's licenses? Security aspects of both proofs of identity and the card security features as well.
They were developed jointly, so I think there's a lot of overlap, but my office, a different office has oversight over commercial driver's licenses.
Are you talking about Department of Transportation, or are you talking about a different part of DHS?
TSA does.
TSA does commercial driver's licenses.
Well, hazmat endorsements for commercial driver's licenses.
Well, I'm aware of the hazmat endorsement aspect very well. I'm just a bit concerned that some of the states have not updated the processes for commercial driver's licenses to meet the same standards, because they do overlap, but they're actually weaker as far as non-hazmat commercial driver's licenses.
So, no, I mean, I guess on the day-to-day commercial driver's licenses, the DOT has the lead on that.
Yeah, well, that would be an interesting question for lawyers. So we'll skip the answer, since you're saying that, at least from an administrative point of view, your office focuses on passenger-level driver's licenses.
Correct.
Or conventionals. Okay, next slide, Sean. Okay, this is the most complex question, and Department of Homeland Security has not had much time to prepare for this, but they are well aware of this issue. And without reading the entire paragraph, Real ID, the statute itself, provided a clear set of what the rules were for lawful presence. And the reason that law did that was nowhere else is there a single document or single law that establishes who is or is not lawfully present. And until fairly recently, this was considered to be status quo. However, now, because of the President's executive order and the earlier 2012 DACA order, many legal questions have been raised about item number 7 above, which is deferred action status. And as the second paragraph explains, was a minor category involving fewer than 10,000 people in 2005, and actually the number I had at the time as staffer in Congress was 2,000 people, and was the indirect result of prosecutorial discussions, court decisions, a variety of complex, highly individualized legal issues. Okay. However, under the innovative decisions of the White House and the Department of Justice, it is now going to include somewhere in the range of 5 million people, possibly as soon as the end of this coming year. So it's gone from being this rather obscure area to another issue. Now, a lawsuit was filed, I guess, yesterday by 17 states challenging the authority of the President to do that. So almost immediately, states are revisiting this whole category issue to determine whether or not they are going to issue driver's licenses under the category of Real ID compliant, or whether they're going to issue them as non-Real ID compliant, or whether they're not going to issue them at all. Arizona and Nebraska currently don't issue them at all. But most of the rest of the states issue full-term driver's licenses to the DACA recipients. So the question is, should states provide only temporary driver's license to DACA and DAPA recipients, limiting the term of date to the date of the DACA-DAPA expiration? That's a question we have for DHS. Are you prepared to provide any comments or response to that question?
Not on that specific aspect of it. I think broadly speaking, under the Real ID Act, what we're really looking at is do they have a employment authorization document, and that is generally what we look at on the deferred action question.
But that employment, but most states that do use the authorization document, at least half of them that I've looked at, limit the driver's license expiration to the term of the authorization document, which is the same status as legal immigrants under H-1s and H-2s. So you don't really care, is what you're saying.
I'm saying, beyond, we really treat it in the same way as we treated EADs before.
Which are as immigration documents.
So, so the state policies that
Well, it's actually a Real ID
to the previous
policy, because
DACA.
if it's an immigration document, then it has to expire concurrent, your rule does, that the driver's license should expire concurrent with the term of the immigration document. That's in the rule, which has not been revised. All right, question 5. Will the Department of Homeland Security provide useful legal information about the type of legal status that deferred action on deportation confers on recipients so that the state governments can make informed decisions regarding state-awarded benefits such as driver's license? That question has to do with the Office of Legal Counsel from the Department of Justice. I just read that memorandum in detail along with the state's challenge to it before this meeting, and it cites DHS as saying that deferred action does not provide lawful status. Explicitly states that. So I think it's really important that somebody reconcile the difference between the Real ID Act, which appears to recognize that deferred action has a kind of legal status, versus the Department of Justice's statement that it does not convey lawful status.
Yeah, and again, and I think
that's all new information, so I can't expect you to respond immediately, Ted. But I think it's
I think there's still a lot of broader things that are being worked out on the implementation of the executive order. So,
I mean, on my own case, I thought clearly at the time Department of Justice requested Congress to include deferred action status that it did convey a lawful status. So it was, let's say, pardon the expression, news to me that the Department of Justice does not think it does.
Yeah. Well,
and it's a very new document that we all haven't seen very much of.
Right. Well, there's a reason I didn't go to law school, and so I get to defer questions about the legal meaning of documents to the appropriate individuals. And
well, appropriate. They need to appear on the scene soon because it's a huge pending issue, and it has all sorts of possible legal ramifications if states believe that employment authorization document for DACA has the same lawful status as it does for people who are lawfully admitted under conventional immigration laws, because the Office of Legal Counsel and its memo to the President says it does not. Explicitly says that multiple times. Okay, can we go to the next page? Okay, you kind of answered question number 6. Are there plans for auditing state driver's license agencies that have self-certified their compliance to validate the claims? The answer was, I guess, you've already implied that you don't have authority to do that. Is that right?
We don't have. We could have the authority to do that, but right now we do not have plans to do auditing.
Okay. Question 7. You've already, I think, answered that through your presentation, which is, would you say that there's been a meaningful improvement in security, and how do you measure success regarding the Real ID Act? You said that you do believe that it is far more secure, and I think this gives you an opportunity, Ted, if you'd like to lay out individual measures of success regarding Real ID Act.
Well, again, the big numbers that I'm looking at are, the overall nationally how close we are to full compliance. And again, we're in the 78% done. Another 9 or so percent that's in process, so we're in the high 80s that we're either there or have a clear path towards there. So that's one measure that we're looking at. On individual standards, for the most part, they're all in the 70% met or above. So, we have seen very, we have seen not only good participation overall, but, looking at the actual measures themselves, that they're not being left, individual ones are not being left behind. What we're finding is, 5 states may have met 35 of the 43 requirements, just to pick some numbers out of the air, but the specific 35 they met could be different. So that's why we're also looking to see a degree of consistency across the various requirements. And honestly, a measure we have is the level of communication and cooperation we have with states. Early on when I started, there was a lot of suspicion and concerns and, worried about, well, will we even talk to you? And that I have seen fairly rapidly go away, where we've been able to lay out what we're doing, what our plans are, as transparently as possible, and states being able to see that and evaluate for themselves sort of what is fact and what is myth. Really, in a lot of cases, come to that conclusion of, well, these are the things that we want to do anyway. So we do find, I find that just on how we work with states has been very positive over the past 2 or 3 years, and probably a very strong improvement. And mostly, I will take the blame on our agency's part. While a lot of things were being decided, we couldn't be as transparent as we would have liked to have been, sort of as the process was happening. But now we have, by putting out this phased enforcement plan, we were really able to get into specifics and have a lot more transparency with the states, and I think that has been a great benefit both for the states and for the federal government.
I'm going to volunteer, this is Brian Zimmer again, I'm going to volunteer 2 other metrics that are employed within, by individual states who are complying with Real ID, which is how many of their drivers have actually been through the Real ID compliance, their identity authentication. And what that means is if a state become compliant 3 months ago, shall we say, how many of their actual citizens in that state have gone through the process of verification of, authentication of identity and being issued a Real ID compliant driver's license versus how many are their residents are under the legacy driver's licenses issued under legacy processes that may be quite incomplete compared to Real ID compliant processes. Have you made any effort to develop that kind of quantification?
Not as yet, because we can't require the states to provide us with that information. So we have some states that have volunteered it, such as, Utah has done everybody.
Right.
Delaware has done everybody.
Right.
Georgia is fairly close to everybody, or they have done at least, I believe, 3/4. So it is really, that is not a data point that's being collected nationwide.
Well, I would encourage you to look at seeking that out on a voluntary basis, simply because I think it helps provide incentives for other states as a method of comparison.
It is one of the discussion points.
In their own way.
As I said, we're doing a 2015 study, and that is part of the discussion of it. But again, we have no ability to require a state to.
You can't compel it, but you might ask them on a survey basis.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that would be very useful, I think, in terms of seeing where we really are on an individual basis, which is where, from my point of view, the rubber hits the road. Okay, number 8, is there a provision of the Real ID Act? And I want to say, and I'm saying as extended, the rule itself is what lays out the specifics. Are there 1 or 2 parts of the rule that your analysis indicates have been most valuable in confirming the applicant's claims of identity?
Well, I believe it's it's more the consistent practices across the board. So it's hard to point at
exceptions and having straightforward, clear requirements such as original documents.
Things like that, and also the ability, the requirement that the people looking at the documents have had fraudulent document training, that they've gone through security clearances themselves, so you're combating both the potential for insider threat, and the potential for just someone being able to sneak fraud through the system. So it's hard to isolate individual pieces because the way it's all designed is for the individual pieces to really interlock, and that's what gives you the security more than any individual practice.
I think that's a good answer from my point of view. Sean, have we picked up any questions from anybody on the webinar?
We did have one question, and it was sort of answered early on in the questions, and folks may be able to at least glean the answer from what you've said so far. But the question was, and this is in this person's language and not my own, but it says, do the classes of immigrants recently immunized by President Obama count as lawfully present for purposes of Real ID?
And that question is, I thought it did, but it doesn't, according to the state lawsuits, the Office of Legal Commission, and in fact testimony Tuesday by the administration's designated surrogate, who was executive director of the Immigration Law Center, who said explicitly to Chairman Goodlatte when he asked the question, no, they are not lawfully present, which was a surprise to me.
From the perspective of our office, it all depends on the approved status, which ends up in the issuance of an employment authorization document. So to us, that's the real test. So if a person is getting the EAD, that is really what we look to.
And again, I'm going to respond that the lawsuit by the 17 states intends to overturn that, which will throw this consideration into a new state, which remains to be determined by whatever the outcome of the court case is. So I think we will have to wait to provide a definitive answer until the court case is resolved, and whatever that might take years. So in the meantime, I think Ted's position is consistent with other earlier status determinations. The key issue is the issuance of an employment authorization document and a Social Security card number, because that goes together in that particular amnesty provision. Okay, next one.
Well, actually, gentlemen, we're right at 2 o'clock now, it looks like, or close to it. And so we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Thanks to Ted Sobel and to Brian Zimmer both for sharing their expertise. And next slide. Here's how you can get, next slide. Here's how you can get in touch with us if you have any additional questions. This webinar will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center in the coming days in case you missed a portion of the event or want to pass along the link to someone else who may be interested in learning more about Real ID. Be sure to keep an eye on the CSG website for future eCademy webinar events. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thank you for joining us, and good afternoon.